Welcome to Inner Compass. I'm Karen Saupe. If marriage is more than a piece of paper, why is it often easier to get married than it is to buy a car? Our guest today will talk about the many ways that marriage has been understood throughout Western history, and he'll suggest ways that we might be able to strengthen and enrich the institution today. Join us on Inner Compass.
From the campus of Calvin College, this is Inner Compass, exploring how people use faith and ethics to guide them through critical issues of today.
My guest today is John Witte, Jr., Professor of Law and Ethics and Director of the Center for the Study of Law and Religion at Emory University. He has published widely on historical and current marriage law, including the book Covenant Marriage in Comparative Perspective, which we'll explore with him today. Welcome, John.
Thank you very much. Good to be here.
Western philosophers have talked about the benefits of marriage throughout history. How far back does marriage go, really?
Well, marriage goes back to the story of Genesis 1 and 2, when a man and a woman come together in marriage, the two become one flesh. We have very ancient Roman, Greek, Sumerian, and other legal provisions in place dealing with marriage, trying to deal with inheritance questions, trying to deal with the relationship between a parent and a child. Marriage as an institution is ancient. It's been talked about since we've had recorded history in the West.
And I mean, this may seem like an obvious question, but what are the benefits of marriage historically? Why is it promoted so widely throughout history?
Well, in part because we try to tack relationships. We want to figure out who is responsible for a child that's produced in the world, who that child is responsible for when that person becomes older. Part of it is a property question. To whom does one devise one's property upon death? Part of it's a question of alliance. With whom does one deal in forging relationships between different actors, be it clans, families, tribes, broader civilizations.
Sure.
And part of it's just the basic way of channeling sexual expression, sexual aggression, and finding ways to make that productive and to create an institution that becomes a foundation for a variety of other institutions. I mean, Aristotle, for example, called the family the start of the polis. It is the first institution. John Locke, 2,000 years later, called family the first contract and called marriage the first relationship that's forged to create a family.
Okay, so it's a microcosm, a bigger society.
The microcosm. It's the first school, it's the first church, it's the first state, it's the first society, and it's been recognized as such in the Western tradition for 3 millennia.
Okay. John Milton in the 17th century wrote about marriage as ideally a conversation between a man and a woman, which I think is a nice image. Obviously, there's a great deal more to it, but you've talked about marriage as several things, and will you talk about the 4 ways that one can look at marriage?
Yeah, if you spend time looking at some of the Hebrew writings, some of the Greek and Roman writings before Christianity, and then Christian writings, marriage is viewed as in a 4-fold perspective. In one, first and foremost, marriage is a contract between the parties. It depends upon the mutual consent of the parties, and in essence, it's a bilateral relationship between the two. But marriage is more than a mere contract. Marriage is also a natural association, a way that parties come together to follow their natural inclinations, both to be together, to express their troth to each other, and to procreate together. Marriage is also a social institution. Marriage is the place through which we transmit property. We attach a set of expectations to the parties. It's a place where we identify a unit in society that goes beyond the individual. And then marriage in the tradition is also a spiritual association. It's subject to the creed, the code, the cult, the confessional community of which a party is a part. And we've used a variety of terms in the tradition to describe that spiritual dimension. Sometimes it's a sacrament, one of the 7 sacraments in the Catholic tradition, which is a channel of grace. Sometimes it's viewed as a covenant, a special relationship where a man and a woman come together to form a relationship with each other, but also to form a relationship together with God. And God becomes a third party to that covenant. Sometimes it's expressed as simply a form of super contract, something that goes beyond and trumps every other contractual or voluntary relationship a party has. These are 4 dimensions: the natural, the contractual, the social, and the spiritual, that you can find throughout the Western tradition in a variety of different ancient and modern formulations of what marriage is.
And it is possible to have a marriage without all 4 of those dimensions in consideration, I imagine, but historically those have been the ways that people think about what it is, right?
Well, this is a philosophical or theological take on what the
Yeah.
institution is.
In contemporary America, I think that most of us initially think of marriage as basically an emotional commitment, right? You're in love, this is a romantic issue, and so, and you work out the finances and the other situations, but traditionally, historically, this has been about social stability, it's been about financial stability. It's my sense of it is that way back in the day, you married someone and then learned to love them, maybe.
Yeah, I think there are certainly evidence of love taking a greater and greater priority in our calculus of marital troth today.
Mm-hmm.
But love, marital love, historically is not something that is missing at all.
It's always been
love poetry,
Okay.
elaborate courtship rituals, the etiquette of interaction with one's prospective spouse, the giving of gifts, the romantic appeals. This is not unusual. You could find Greek and Roman texts. You can find wonderful love ballads in ancient Hebrew literature. We have 8th and 9th and 10th century Muslim books of etiquette, books of flower. They go on for hundreds of pages, which are elaborate reflections on the emotion of love. So love is an ingredient of marriage in many historical recollections of it, reflections on it. But love certainly has become the sine qua non of marriage in the 21st century. And that if a party does not love the other party, there's no sense getting married. And that if love dies, that is considered to be a ground on which the parties should separate or divorce. Historically, absence of love was not a sufficient ground for divorce.
But today it is.
Today it certainly is, because we have a no-fault system.
In Christian tradition, I mean, Jesus doesn't marry. Paul doesn't exactly glorify marriage. In fact, he describes it or advocates it as an antidote to lust, which is not really the highest praise you could give the institution. And yet, over time, marriage has become more central and I think more promoted in the Christian tradition. Why is that?
Yeah, there's no question that the New Testament is not a good Dr. Spock on marriage.
Right.
There are a number of passages that are important about the marriage institution, but it's quite obviously a deprecated institution, and the deprecation that especially St. Paul in 1 Corinthians 7 gives to the institution introduces into the Western Christian tradition a very elaborate attachment to chastity, to celibacy, to renunciation of marriage. And that's coupled with an existing Stoic understanding that philosophers, those who want to pursue a contemplative life, should not pursue marriage because it's an obstacle, a distraction, and ultimately a sacrifice. One has to sacrifice one's contemplative life in order to pursue the corporal life of marriage. Christianity does, however, inherit from Judaism a robust understanding of marriage and family life, which is stated throughout the Pentateuch and the Talmudic literature, which the Church Fathers knew. Christianity also had a very strong understanding of marriage from the Roman legal system that was in place prior to the 4th century Christianization of Rome. Rome cherished marriage in the pre-Christian era. Marriage was one of the sine qua nons of Roman citizenship. It was the best way of achieving all the goods we talked about earlier, and marriage was cherished as a very important civic, moral, and spiritual good that a person could pursue. And the interesting thing about the Christianization of the Roman Empire after the 4th century is that it also introduced the Romanization of Christianity. And one way that the Romanization of Christianity began to manifest itself is in this growing appetite for marriage as a healthy and important institution.
So that's part of the way that it overcomes Paul's the stigma that Paul helps attach.
Yeah, I mean, the Bible remains an anchor text, and there's still counsel for those that have received the gift of continence to forego marriage. But increasingly after the 4th century, the normative position of the tradition is celibacy is good for monastics and for clerics, but marriage is good for the laity and for the vast majority of the population. And by the time the 11th and 12th century rolls around and the Christian church starts taking over lawmaking power or jurisdiction over marriage, a marriage has become a sacrament in the eyes of the lawyers and the theologians.
So it's very much, so then the laws are very much shaped by.
And the laws are shaped by the reality that, look, marriage is one of those goods that God gives us. It's good for faith, it's good for friendship, it's good for children, it's good for stability, it's good for support, it's good for a variety of things. We elevate one of the passages is St. Paul's 1 Corinthians 7 treatment of marriage, where he talks about conjugal debts or conjugal rights, that parties have a right to the sex, the support, protection of the other. That becomes a very important part of the new apparatus in the 11th and 12th century of Christian marriage. And then ultimately we begin to find in the 12th and 13th century that the church is in the business of trying to take this unruly sexual behavior of late antique and early medieval society, where marriage really did begin to fracture, and where prostitution, concubinage, and various types of sexual interaction was rife, and to impose upon that unruly society a set of institutional structures through marriage as the first institution. That was one of the tasks of the church, and on the brute economic legal side, that complemented the growing theological and philosophical appetite for marriage as a good way of life.
Well, and that is interesting to me because Luther in the Reformation just says this celibacy stuff isn't reasonable, that people really can't do this, and so we need to strengthen and promote marriage, which doesn't contradict what Paul says, but Luther is just maybe more realistic about it.
Well, Luther has the benefit of 1,600 years of experience that Paul didn't have. Luther also had the what he called the perils of monasticism and the perils of celibacy, where the temptations of sexual sin were heightened with each year of continued monastic seclusion. And he found, on the basis of reading the tradition, on the basis of his own biographical experience, that prescribed or required celibacy as a condition for holding monastic or clerical office was in many ways to violate human nature. That God had created the institution of marriage with a set of goods, and one of the goods that marriage gave a person was the good of protection from sexual sin. It gave them more things than that. It's not just an opportunity to discharge one's sexual, brutal, lustful appetites, although inevitably marriage provides that kind of natural, proper outlet for one's natural sexual drives. Luther saw that very clearly, and saw that trying to cabin that sexual expression as a condition for holding an ordained office within the church was in many ways destructive and distracting. And it led to a level of hypocrisy in society that he thought was unbecoming. Popes fathering 20 illegitimate children and pretending to be celibate, a variety of forms of homosexual expression within monastic communities and a lesbian expression within cloistered communities, a variety of forms of ritual concubinage where monks and abbots would have their own concubines, and they would pay a concubine tax or a whore tax, as it was called. Luther decided that the hypocrisy of this is simply overcoming the legitimacy of that kind of fence between the celibate clergy and the married laity. And his argument was, marriage is a good institution. God created it. Let's go back to Genesis 1 and 2. Let's recognize that the two do become one flesh. Let's recognize that we're created to become one flesh, that we have the natural appetite, the natural apparatus to come together, and that it's a good thing in its own right. And that if it gives rise to children, it's an even more wonderful thing. It's an opportunity to create, to be a co-creator with God, to continue the creation, and to live out the creation mandate of being fruitful and multiply. And that's how Luther starts his critique.
Church and state are very much one in many societies throughout history, but as you move into American society, the separation of church and state complicates the question of marriage, I think, a bit, because now it's defined both as a religious institution and as a legal institution. What kind of conflicts arise between legal and religious definitions of marriage in say, 20th century America?
Yeah, I guess if the perspective is what does the law require, increasingly the story of the late 19th and the 20th and 21st century is that legal definitions of marriage have increasingly become exclusively state questions. The state, and in this case, the individual 50 states that have principal jurisdiction over marriage, they define what marriage is. They set the rules for marriage formation, maintenance, and dissolution. They decide the rules of child support, child custody, child control, They decide rules about child support and alimony and other post-marital incidents. Historically, some of those roles were played by religious bodies. From the late 19th century to the early 21st century, all those issues have come to the state for final resolution. And the role of the church in that has shifted from playing what historically was a legal role alongside the role of the state to exclusively a spiritual or a pastoral or ministerial role. And what I mean by that is that increasingly we have this notion that marriage as a contract is the issue that the state deals with, and marriage is more than a mere contract is the issue that churches or other religious or civic groups deal with.
You talk about marriage as a covenant, and so I want us to explore the relationship or the differences between marriage as a contract and marriage as a covenant being a promise that both parties enter into, and that has a religious dimension to it.
Has a religious dimension. So it's formed carefully and prayerfully by the couple in conversation with God in prayer, but also in conversation with God's agents in this earthly kingdom, namely their parents, their witnesses, and other members of the community. It is formed by a spiritual ceremony, a consecration or some kind of church service where the couples pledge publicly before God and before the congregation, and with the invocation of the help of the congregation, to live together faithfully as husband and wife. It is repeated again in the baptismal vows. When we baptize a child, inevitably as part of that exercise in many denominations, it's an invitation to the family and to the community to help the couple raise that child. It very much is a communal dimension.
When I think about a contract, if I enter into a contract, my main interest is how do I protect my interests? What is in this for me? When I enter into a covenant, I'm thinking a lot about the other person or party and what I owe them in terms of spiritual and emotional support, commitments, and yes, maybe financial and so forth. So covenant seems like a much richer relationship that's designed to help both parties grow together and become more.
Yeah, Calvin called marriage a cruciform relationship. He's the one that really put into the Western tradition this very strong notion of covenant, marriage as a covenant. And his notion is that, look, Ephesians 5 talks about you lay your body down, you lay your life down for your spouse. And it's a perennial, daily set of sacrifices that you make for the other. It's very much a sacrificial love that you make for the other. And that goes well beyond the contractual rights and duties that you have, which are sometimes enforceable. We are sinful creatures. We need to have those boundaries. We need to have those responsibilities.
So you wouldn't want marriage without contract?
Marriage without contract is dead.
Okay.
Marriage as a contract is essential to making it real, because we're sinful creatures, and we need laws to bind us, to hold us, and a set of responsibilities that even in our worst forms we can't trespass those responsibilities. Marriage as contract guarantees that. But marriage as covenant elevates us and elevates our relationship beyond those, the tit for tat for contract exchange, beyond simply keeping score about what we're doing and raising it. There is a movement in the United States over the last 10 years to respond to what has become a rather deep marriage crisis, especially the notion that about a third of all children are born to single mothers, a third of all children are being aborted, half of all marriages ends in divorce, 2/3 of African American children are being raised without any
So this could stand some improvement, this institution.
The institution has really in the last 40 years had rather severe changes sociologically introduced within and beyond the church. I mean, the church is really not immune from that. Indeed, some Protestant churches actually are ahead of the numbers that we see in the general society. And so one of the responses to that legally, what the states have tried to do is to say, well, let's try to find ways of making marriage more than an easy in, easy out contract. It's much easier to get married than it is to buy a car. It's much easier to get divorced than it is to sever a contract with Sears for a fridge.
And you said that it should be as hard to get out of a marriage as it is to get into a marriage.
And covenant marriage is trying to design to do that. Covenant marriage basically said, let's thicken the requirements of entrance and let's thicken the requirements of exit. If you have easy exit, then you have to have easy entrance. But if you make exit hard, you should make formation hard. There was something very cruel in the medieval tradition that said it was so easy to get married. It just required consent between the couple and sometimes consummation. And they were married indissolubly for life.
Yes.
That's cruel. You should have much thicker formation requirements, and that's in part what the Protestant reformers and eventually the Tridentian reformers did with, you have to have an engagement, you have to have 2 witnesses, you have to have parental consent, you have to have church consecration, you have to have civil registration before we're going to call this a marriage. Once you do all that and all those checks and balances are there, then you're indissolubly bound for life.
And when you've invested that much in coming into it, it's going to inevitably be more complicated to come out of it.
It's going to become more complicated out, and you'll be deterred along the way if it's not appropriate for you. And that's exactly what covenant marriage is doing in 3 states that have it in place: Louisiana, Arizona, and Arkansas. All 3 states say you have Jack and Jill, when they march up to the marriage registry, have 2 options: traditional contract marriage, easy in, easy out, or covenant marriage, which has thicker formation requirements, a waiting period, counseling that's required, an oath that has to be sworn, and thicker exit requirements. Again, a waiting period, separation of bed and board for at least 2 years, and the identification of hard fault: adultery, divorce, desertion, cruelty, abuse of child or abuse of spouse. Separation is immediately available in one of those cases, but divorce again is postponed for 2 years until the parties have sorted out what the stakes are. And part of it's marriage is too high a stakes game for it to be driven by impulse.
Right.
It has to be driven by either way, in or out, and it has to be driven by deeper, thicker calculus and involvement of other parties, and that's exactly what the covenant marriage movement is trying to do. It hasn't worked, frankly.
The covenant marriage?
No, they haven't. Nobody's doing it.
Oh, nobody's doing it.
Nobody's doing
Nobody's
it.
choosing
1 or 2% of marriages in each of those 3 states is now a covenant marriage, and the problem is that you can walk across the state line to the next state and get divorced using the traditional easy out rules and conflict of laws rules as they exist today. Don't preclude a party from doing that.
So really it's going to be up to the couples to decide that this is going to matter more, right?
Yes.
I mean, you mentioned in your book that if, for instance, one party wanted to enter into a covenant marriage and the other one didn't, that would right there be something for the first party to think very hard about.
Absolutely.
Why doesn't? And as I think about it, would I want to marry somebody who wasn't willing to commit that time into preparing for the marriage?
And in that sense, it has worked because it has deterred unripe, inappropriate marriages. Look, when Jack and Jill march up to the marriage registry, and the clerk says to you, "Now, Jack, would you like to have a marriage presumptively for life that's covenant, 6-month waiting period, and you can't get out unless you do the following things? Or would you like to get married 2 days from now and get divorced without cause, with just a couple steps and a little bit of money?" And Jack says, "Sure, I'll take that one." And Jill's thinking, "My word," or vice versa. Right? That should deter those parties from going forward.
So these laws might be more successful than we realize if they are preventing marriages that shouldn't be moving forward.
But the regrettable thing is that, notwithstanding Katrina, marriage rates have actually increased in those 3 states. So it's the data are ambivalent. And
so people are choosing the easy.
People are choosing easy and easy out.
The contract marriage.
Now, what's interesting about the covenant marriage movement is it's inducing people to think very hard about whether we should have more off-the-rack models of marriage that the state makes available. A whole bundle of rights, a whole bundle of responsibilities, a whole bundle of duties that the parties have to discharge or can be guaranteed when they enter into something called a marriage. And they can opt out of certain of those individual provisions, but they have to accept the full package otherwise. That's been a pretty interesting movement that has brought the right and the left together. The right likes it because, well, we would like to think about getting out of the marriage, getting the state out of the marriage business and taking marriage back into our jurisdiction. We'd like to have marriage formation, maintenance, divorce, inheritance, education, charity, all done by our own community. It's kind of the Kuyperian pillar system now reasserting itself in the marriage sphere. And there is a movement apart in a number of religious communities to make that real. And we can contemplate that for Catholic canon law, but boy, could we contemplate that for Muslim Sharia?
Right.
Could we contemplate it for Orthodox Jewish communities?
And if we're Muslim, we can, of course. Right. So,
but the question is whether the state will allow some of its citizens to voluntarily renounce the protections of state law and to become exclusively subject to the jurisdiction of Sharia religious court. The left, by contrast, likes this off-the-rack model proliferation because, well, we can have same-sex marriage, we can have polygamous marriage, we can have dependency relationships, all of which we can call marriage. We just create more options, and we have 6 or 7 or 8 off-the-rack models you can pick as you go to the marriage registry.
And so you've suggested that it might be a good thing to have a contract dimension to a marriage that is sort of a threshold. These are minimum rights that are retained by the parties, and these are minimum obligations. And then on top of that, covenantal dimension that might vary by religious tradition, right?
Yeah, and I think that's de facto where we are today. That parties recognize they have to go to the marriage registry, they have to get their marriage contract, they have to do the requisites that the state requires to form or to exit from the union. But if they live in a religious or a cultural community, that religious or cultural community increasingly has its own set of norms and expectations that those parties have to meet. And a condition for continued association with that community is living by those norms. And if you don't, I'm sorry, but you're going to have to leave.
Yeah. There's a corollary in private school threshold requirements where a private school can do what it likes as long as it has done some very basic things that are mandated by law.
That's going to be, I think, the template on which a dual jurisdictional system of marriage might proceed in this country. I've forecasted the possibility of this multiple off-the-rack model approach, but another approach might well be a kind of dual jurisdiction approach, which basically does, in the marriage area, what we had historically over a long period of time worked out in the education area.
Well,
and I suspect that's going to be a more productive course of action.
Great. Much food for thought there. Thank you very much. My guest today has been John Witte, Jr., Professor of Law and Ethics and Director of the Center for the Study of Law and Religion at Emory University. I'm Karen Saupe. Thank you for watching Inner Compass.